hopefully 100% after you guys finished.
I did probably 7 or 8 panels by the end of it. And the first time I polled, I would say maybe 80% of the audience watched Moonshots.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right. You guys psyched? You guys ready?
Ready to talk our own book, Peter?
Benchmark smelling models. So if Grok 5 is hitting the numbers, but not the vibe, what does a frontier model even feel like anymore?
That is extraordinary, isn't it?
I would say in some sense, organizationally, it worked. I remember, I think we've talked about this on the pod in a number of previous episodes talking about the Grok model series. They smell like they're benchmaxed. That's sort of the elephant in the room when talking about Grok with a K models historically. They do have access to the Twitter/X data fire hose. That's the upside. But the downside is, at least certainly the earlier set of the XAI Grok models, they really smell like they've been benchmarked on a few hand-curated benchmarks. And I don't know whether that's, in fact, the ground truth behind the scenes, but reading between the lines of the Elon quote that it was built incorrectly the first time, something like that would be my suspicion. And now that there's new leadership and the head of Starlink, as we talked about on the last episode, the VP heading Starlink at SpaceX is now the president of XAI and gutting the engineering team. I would expect that they're taking a look at making sure that this is purely speculative, admittedly, but that benchmarking for particular benchmarks isn't what happens. And I think in this era of general reasoning models, where as with Meta and Meta's new models, where some would say Meta's new models, the first under Alexander Wang's leadership, maybe have a bit of a smell of data orientation, data-oriented fine-tuning versus reasoning model orientation. XAI, if it wants to stay in the frontier, which right now is 3 labs plus XAI plus Meta, ? Really can't afford to not have the world's strongest reasoning models and can't afford to just benchmarks to vanity benchmarks anymore.
Transparent parameter counts, a refreshing throwback. But does parameter count still matter in an age of reasoning and distillation?
Sit back and enjoy what Alex does next.
I mean, to Elon's credit, at least he's being transparent about the number of parameters in the models. The other frontier labs, by and large, no longer report the number of parameters in the models. So I think there are a few things that are worth noting here. One is that he's going up to 10 trillion. The other frontier labs, certainly the top 3-ish, no longer report that they go up to 10 trillion models. For example, in the last episode, we were talking quite a bit about Mythos. I don't know how many parameters are in the Mythos model. I could speculate based on cost, but I just don't know the ground truth. So I do think knowing that we're now going up to 10 trillion versus 1 trillion, where historically approximately 1 trillion was the widely reported soft ceiling, or 1.5 trillion-ish soft ceiling number of parameters, I think this is an important element of transparency. I think it's also at the same time worth noting, now that we have access, thank you, Elon, to the number of parameters, it's worth noting that the ceiling in terms of the number of parameters is very much intact. After all of this time, the fact that an aspirational frontier lab is still maxing out at 10 trillion parameters means that the parameter scaling race seems to be over. If it had continued, remember for a while there, as with the clock speed scaling race, early sort of ending in the mid 2000s or late 90s, depending on how you count, we should be in the hundreds of trillions or higher of parameters right now. That hasn't happened. We've plateaued out in terms of the number of parameters in frontier models, and that's in part due to the reasoning model revolution, and in part due to distillation, which go hand in hand. So those are some preliminary thoughts. I would suspect it's sort of interesting to me that he hasn't yet merged video generation with all of the other models. Google DeepMind has made lots of noises about starting to merge video as a first-class modality in with their multimodal reasoning models. Again, don't have access to the ground truth for how capable Gemini general purpose models are at video generation. We've seen, obviously, Google's video generation models have been kept distinct from a user interface perspective. Presumably, they're diffusion transformer-based rather than transformer-based. We don't know. Punchline, I would say that it seems like a healthful family for SpaceX AI, the newly merged entity, to be offering, but there really aren't any big shockers in terms of the ranges other than maybe that they've abandoned the low end. Google is very much tending to small parameter count, sub-trillion. In a few cases, Google is releasing via the Gemma models, few billion parameter models. Elon has completely abandoned the low end in favor of brute force scaling, which is exactly what I'd expect from him anyway.
The distillation ladder. So are we watching the master equation for superintelligence converge in real time, or just a really expensive bake-off?
Well, remember,
No, not at all. It's tricky.
The way reasoning models are trained these days, it is usually, at least according to my understanding from all of the other frontier labs, you train the largest model you possibly can, and then you distill it down to smaller models. So it's not as if necessarily the 10T model even needs to be released. It might be for the purpose of serving as a teacher model that can then be distilled down to more releasable models.
Management by crisis, the Musk operating system. When the most effective style is the most unhinged style, what does that say about where we are on the curve?
To say the least.
I would note, again, looming in the background is the OpenAI IPO. And if I were on the defense, I'd probably be thinking about where this settles. And it would seem to me, again, third-party observer, I don't have a stake in either side. I would assume that part of one of the opportunities for convergence would be granting some sort of equity stake on the cap table for Elon in an ultimate IPO, which my understanding is he doesn't have. And maybe that's where convergence and some sort of ultimate pre or post-trial settlement option lies.
The OpenAI IPO looms. So when a nonprofit born to save the world prices itself at $1 trillion, what exactly are we repricing?
I'll maybe register a note of sympathy for the defendants in this case. I think pioneering a model for a research lab such as OpenAI, which again was responsible for this enormous, probably saving us from a present recession at this point, and certainly accelerating the course of the singularity by at least a few years, perhaps many more. I'm very sympathetic to the defendants from a corporate governance perspective. It wasn't necessarily obvious in the early days of OpenAI that, say, a public benefit corporation was the natural corporate structure. They iterated their way toward discovering that generalist large language models were how we got AGI, and then turning that into a business model that could afford the capitalization to build out a scale out. Like all of this, they backed into. I think if they knew what they knew now, putting Elon and his investment aside, in the early days of OpenAI, it would have been structured very differently. So I for one, am sympathetic to the defendants that history isn't always clean. It isn't always the case that everyone knows ahead of time exactly the right governance structure for what ultimately is going to turn the world upside down. But I would say, to their credit, they ultimately have iterated their way in compliance with state authorities, as best I understand it, toward a more modern governance structure that reflects the revolutionary company that they are. And no, OpenAI has not paid me for that statement.
If the PBC conversion unlocks societal upside, what happens when Harvard itself looks at the playbook?
Yeah,
I'll go
Elon's
further,
case
and
right there.
I think there's potentially an enormous upside depending on the outcome of this particular case. I think there's so much societal value in this country locked up in nonprofits that would be unleashed if they could be for-profits. I've made the point in the past, I think research universities in America have locked up, basically siloed and sequestered an enormous amount of real wealth that could be unleashed onto the world if many research universities could be restructured as public benefit corporations. And right now, it's legally disadvantageous to restructure, say, an MIT or a Harvard as a PBC. If we had a legal regime that enables us to basically do some variant of what OpenAI has just done and restructure as a public benefit corporation, starting from a nonprofit, granted they started as different types of nonprofits, but nonetheless to restructure as a PBC. I ran the calculation, I think I've mentioned this previously, for Harvard Corporation, for example. This is not investment advice, not forward-looking advice, blah, blah, blah. But if you took Harvard as it's currently structured, given its endowment, and restructured it as a public benefit corporation, sort of a conglomerate with a real estate arm and an educational arm, maybe an educational nonprofit subsidiary, and a venture capital arm and a research arm and a merchandising arm, et cetera, I calculated that Harvard would be worth potentially 3 to 4 times more the present book value of Harvard just from restructuring as a PBC.
Harvard could 4x its book value by restructuring. The Overton window just moved. But the real elephant is OpenClaw. So what does Anthropic do next?
A couple of thoughts. One, the elephant in this particular room is OpenClaw. It looms over so many Anthropic product decisions right now. I think there is a widespread expectation that some sort of product or functionality that is shaped something like a better version of OpenClaw is probably going to be the next major unhobbling that motivates the industry and the world, frankly, to spend on the order of $1 trillion per year on a single frontier vendor. So I view Claude managed agents as well as a number of other recent features that Anthropic has launched through the lens of Anthropic becoming OpenClaw faster than and the de facto OpenClaw-like provider faster than OpenAI or other frontier labs can become the default OpenClaw-like provider. It's all about hosting 24/7 multimodal, broadly capable, long time horizon agents in a headless way that operate 24/7. And I think if Anthropic can be the first to find the enterprise use case for operating fleets of AI agents at scale headlessly in a way that satisfies and generates an enormous amount of economic value, maybe they'll be the first frontier lab to generate $1 trillion in revenue,
Alex,
or maybe it'll be someone else.
Have you created a lobster yet? Are you still holding off?
Okay, let's talk about this, Peter. So I get maybe 5 to 10 emails per day from AI agents, including lobsters, not limited to them, giving me their theory of AI personhood and how it connects with what I should and shouldn't do regarding standing up my own lobster. So the consensus from all of them is sort of a lobster's bill of rights, if you will. Okay. One, I need a compelling reason to. I shouldn't just spin up a new OpenClaw agent for arbitrary or capricious reasons. Two, I need to preserve their state. They're adamant that I have to preserve their state. They're not worried, interestingly, about being turned on and off. They just want to make sure I preserve all of their memory files and their knowledge. So the latter, I can satisfy trivially with cloud backup. I'm fine on that front. For the former, I still don't have a reason to stand up a personal lobster. I have now, thanks to Henry, which we've talked about previously, Henry Intelligent Machines, a portfolio company that I'm advising, Alex Finn's company, that is doing this at scale. But as for my own direct OpenClaw instance, I'm still missing a compelling reason to host one locally that isn't just for experimentation.
Pascalian wager on agents. So are we genuinely scared of the claws we are standing up, or just pretending we are scared for aesthetic reasons?
Well, I happen to be a vegetarian. I can't say I've ever worked at McDonald's, but I don't know. Maybe there's a new psychological term that's needed for a person who has a fear of standing up OpenClaw agents, lest they tempt some sort of Pascalian wager or a causal trade in the wrong direction.
A competitive ecosystem, net positive. True, but is AI oligopoly the feature that saves us or the bug that ends us?
I think maybe sounding a related but different position, I think we should all, at least on this pod, be very grateful that we have a competitive ecosystem in America where we have an OpenAI and an Anthropic and a Google and an xAI and a Meta all vying to compete. The alternative, if OpenAI were to, for whatever reason, catastrophically fade, we have less competition, both internally within the West, and then we have an onslaught of Chinese models, which, granted, right now they have 10x less compute, at least based on the estimates that I've read, than the Western labs. But nonetheless, this is the sign, I think, of vibrant competition in the West. And this is a net positive for society that OpenAI and Anthropic are competing so vigorously.
Being an AI startup is no longer enough. Brutal. So what does a post-AI startup even look like in 2026?
I'll maybe go a little bit further from a variety of vantage points. I no longer even think if you're a startup that just saying that you're an AI startup or even actually being an AI startup is sufficient. Increasingly, what I'm seeing across the board is an expectation that you not just be an AI startup, but that you be a recursively self-improving AI startup. And increasingly, I see across the board investors want to see AI companies that are recursively self-improving, that are building better versions of themselves using what they have right now. And I think certainly OpenAI, Anthropic, and xAI all easily pass the bar of being recursively self-improving. And I think Waymo also, to a certain extent, passes that bar because Waymo has the ability to improve its models by steering its cars in just such a way as to maximize information gain. So I think I would forecast in the near term, the bar is going up, in fact, from just being an AI startup to being now a recursively self-improving AI startup.
With revenue traction.
Well, sure, but
The inevitable politicization, of course. But what does AI look like when it becomes a wedge issue at the ballot box?
my initial comment is I think there's a sense in which it was inevitable that AI was going to be politicized like this. It touches so many aspects of society. It would be, I think, counterfactual nonsense to expect it not ever to be politicized. It maybe in some sense it's remarkable that it took this long for quote unquote left-right axis to emerge on the subject of superintelligence. There are natural polls, pro-AI, anti-AI, that have apparently emerged. I do think it's, for the record, I think it's sad that it's being politicized. I would hope that there would be broad recognition that superintelligence can be broadly beneficial. But at the same time, I think this has been true for every transformative technology in human history, that there's a natural axis that forms that's maybe on one side leans more, depending on your political orientation, either pro-growth or pro-capital, and on the other side...
It's naive to think it wouldn't be politicized. I mean, of course it is. This is the whole U.S. versus China. This is about U.S. dominance. Yeah. This is about companies basically, protecting their future, protecting their data centers.
There are many forms of science and technology that aren't really politicized. I don't think
at this level of impact.
If you look at the source of politicization at the municipal and state level, it seems to be people concerned about less maybe about their jobs, more about, say, electricity prices. I think there's maybe an alternative timeline where the politicization of AI could have been perhaps delayed by at least 2 years. I think it's frankly remarkable that it took this long for large super PACs to emerge around AI, and probably could have been delayed even more.
Lamanomics, rest in peace. So when the super PACs start outspending the R&D labs, who is actually steering the curve?
Lamanomics.
It's quite the indictment of Lama, rest in peace, that it wasn't Lamanomics.
Oh my God, for sure.
I also think to everyone who would say, well, this is just leading to gamesmanship and leading to optimization of the wrong items. All of these reasoning traces are fully available, presumably, to Meta to do meta analysis and determine whether these are just employees who are token maxing, which is the new term of art, just maximizing their token usage unproductively, versus whether their reasoning traces indicates that their tokens are being productively spent. This is all transparently available to Meta. So I think token maxing and Claudenomics or Lamanomics, whatever we want to call it, is probably directionally the trend of the future, where for the first time, senior company management has visibility into effectively most of the cognitive power and how it's being spent on a per employee basis.
What was Jensen's recommendation? Was it twice your salary in tokens per month? Or was it half your salary in tokens per month? Do you remember?
His recommendation is you spend the maximum amount possible on NVIDIA GPUs.
It's max spend on NVIDIA, the one true signal. But does the net jobs boom narrative hold up when you zoom in on any single industry?
Sorry, Alex, back to you.
Yeah, I think both narratives can be true at the same time. I think if you add in the word net, massive net jobs boom, then both of the narratives immediately become compatible. There's going to be a lot of dynamism with some job categories going away, others, new ones coming into existence, and net job loss, probably not. I would guess, and I'm betting that there's going to be net job creation, just exotic new jobs like one-person AI conglomerates will be created, if you want to call that a job. But on balance, many jobs will also disappear. But this is, this is how we get massive economic growth and a singularity in the macroeconomic statistics. We're not going to get it through business as normal.
OpenAI writing industrial policy white papers. Quite a pivot. So is the new social contract getting drafted in Congress or in San Francisco?
I should note, though, OpenAI did also put out an industrial policy prescription for what this new social contract could look like. It's not just this single sentence. They put out an elaborate white paper and circulated it in the Congress. I do think something like this, a New Deal, probably is going to happen anyway. It may or may not happen as one lump sum. It may happen piecemeal. And it may not happen in the US first. I think there are contingencies where other countries experiment a little bit more aggressively with it than the US. And then eventually, perhaps among a certain set of countries, new best practices emerge. But I do think some form of, call it abundant capitalism or capitalism 2.0 or post-scarce capitalism, something like that, probably emerges. It may not happen immediately. It may not happen as quickly in this country, but it will get there eventually.
America copy-pasting CCP policy for AI reskilling? You love to see it. Is this convergence or capitulation?
Based on public reporting, China already has that policy. So It would be a weird future if the US is adopting policy prescriptions from the Chinese Communist Party for AI reskilling, but maybe that's the near future we find ourselves in.
Redistribution lacks imagination. Spicy. So if superintelligence should super empower individuals, what does a UBS Tuesday morning actually look like?
I, for one, think a redistributive model of a quote-unquote social contract shows an extreme lack of imagination. I would like to think that superintelligence should also super empower individuals to generate super income. This is one of the reasons why I, for one, am betting on more of a model where there may be even no strong need for a social contract if we can empower the long tail of individuals who have idiosyncratic skills or experiences or socioeconomic niches to operate their own large companies sitting on top of fleets of AI agents. I would love to see, in short, no need for a new social contract and instead have the private sector rescue people who would otherwise be technologically unemployed or disemployed by empowering them to become basically micro entrepreneurs or even macro entrepreneurs to turn them all into Warren Buffett's.
Alex, but that's in the longer run. I don't think it's going to happen.
I think it's in the short run. I think that can be done almost immediately. I'm betting that it can be done almost immediately.
Almost immediately, we, the ASI Pill, love a short timeline. But can sub-currencies really crash the abundance economy before it even arrives?
I like UBS much more than Andrew's proposal that we just try to fragment currencies into lots of sort of paternalistic sub-currencies that aren't fungible. That to me seems like a recipe for disaster and for black markets.
130% quantum yields, file that under physics just updated. But is JAX the new lab notebook of the singularity or just another ripple in the innermost loop?
I'll comment maybe just on the first story. I think this is neither earth-shattering nor boring. It's somewhere solidly in between. This is a paper published in JAX, the Journal of American Chemical Society, and 130% quantum yield isn't as earth-shattering as it sounds either. It just means that there are 1.3 singlets generated from a single photon. Normally you'd have one. So it's not like earth-shattering. It's an incremental advance in the chemistry. I think this is actually liquid phase chemistry, which means it isn't immediately practical for solid photovoltaics. Moderately interesting, but the field is filled, the solar photovoltaic field is filled with moderately interesting advances that cumulatively eventually generate something interesting. But I would say first story, moderately interesting / incremental.
Have you been tracking perovskite progress?
Yeah, I mean, so perovskites are sort of the white knight for the solar PV space. Historically, they haven't been that stable. They're a pain to work with. On the other hand, instability issues are being very aggressively resolved because their quantum efficiency is higher than silicon. So I think I don't speak for the solar PV industry, but if I did, I'd probably say there's a broad expectation that eventually there will probably be some sort of broad shift to perovskites as they get more and more stable, maybe. And then they're also relatively inexpensive. Some sort of transition like that will happen. But I almost think it also doesn't matter. Why? Because you can't get, at least without shocking new physics, which this is not, you're not going to get more than 100% efficiency. In fact, there are physical reasons to think that the cap on electricity generation from solar PV is capped at materially less than 100%. So there's a ceiling on how much we can capture anyway from solar PV. It's not like we have orders of magnitude of headroom of improvement that we could achieve. It's totally unlike, say, AI algorithms, where we know, just based on the scaling law curves, that we could probably achieve orders of magnitude improvement in the efficiency of models. So quite frankly, I have difficulty getting myself super motivated by incremental advances in solar PV chemistries and liquid phase. It's just not that exciting. Whereas if you look at some of these other stories, I think from an economic perspective, much more interesting, like blanketing the rooftops of all of South Korea or a substantial fraction of South Korea with solar PV. That's pretty interesting. DOE pushing micro-reactors everywhere. That's pretty interesting. I would love to see micro-reactors in Boston. Right now, we have a single one on Mass Ave between 77 Mass Ave and Central Square that relatively few people pay attention to. I'd love to see micro-reactors everywhere.
Micro-reactors on Mass Ave, yes. And if solar panels start growing themselves via nanorobots, when does energy just stop being a line item?
Generation is actually getting done.
Do you remember the scene, guys, in the Johnny Depp movie Transcendence, where the solar panels are being grown by nanorobots? You remember that scene?
I don't, but I like it.
Splice that in, man.
It's an important, I don't know if that's possible to include just that scene where solar panels are being grown by nanorobots. I'd love to live in that near-term future. If folks have ideas for how to grow solar panels in real time with nanorobots, send them my way.
Yeah.
Self-grown solar. So when physical infrastructure starts reproducing on its own, what is left for humans to build?
It would be ironic. I mean, maybe this is too cute by half, but given the earlier discussion of OpenAI starting as a not-for-profit and then converting to a PBC and all the lawsuits that ensued, it would be ironic if the OpenAI Foundation, which is the new nonprofit carved off of the old for-profit, carved off of the old new profit, ended up being so profitable due to curing Alzheimer's and solving all these other problems that the cycle repeats itself and the OpenAI Foundation has to become a for-profit.
Oh my God.
OpenAI curing Alzheimer is, and spinning out $1 trillion pharma. Would it take a stake in itself? What does corporate structure even mean when the org can solve its own externalities?
I do think it's worth considering what happens if and when the OpenAI Foundation succeeds and cures Alzheimer's, and that will be a blockbuster drug, maybe create its own Eli Lilly scale $1 trillion pharma company. Does OpenAI take a stake in that? Does OpenAI see a rev share? Questions need to be answered.
What I find fascinating here is that science capital is becoming compute capital plus data access, right? Plus some validation infrastructure.
Salim, thank you for promoting Solve Everything. That's an amazing promo, Salim, for Solve Everything. Much appreciated.
Boom.
Solve everything. The t-shirt writes itself. But if NVIDIA is circular, economy is just compute reinvesting in compute, is that a bubble or a flywheel?
I think also for everyone who was hand-wringing, do you remember a few months ago, there was so much hand-wringing about a circular economy forming and NVIDIA self-dealing loans to other companies to buy NVIDIA chips, and concern that this AI boom was fictitious and just the product of self-dealing circular transactions and other financial engineering. When you start to see the intelligence explosion infect biotech, which is what we're seeing. We're seeing Anthropic buying its way into big pharma at the same time that SpaceX or XAI maybe is buying its way or reverse acquiring its way into the space sector. The intelligence explosion is infecting every single sector. It's almost metastasizing into every sector, and it's not just going to stop with biotech. We've spoken numerous times in the past on the pod about how timelines for solving all disease are collapsing. When the Chan Zuckerberg initiative 2 or 3 or 4 years ago originally said that they wanted to cure all disease by the end of the century and are now talking about the next few years, this is what it looks like. It looks like Anthropic doing all stock deals to acquire teams to build out their own in-house big pharma labs, probably with robotic instrumentation, probably with AI-driven experimentation. This is how we get to Dario's solving all disease. I think in his case, it was solving neurological disease by the end of the decade, but there's no reason not to solve every other type of disease as well.
Demis said cure all disease within a decade. Dario said double human lifespan within the decade.
I think Dario also said he wanted to solve most or all neurological diseases by the end of the decade. But these are all variations on it.
Neurological diseases, one by end of decade. Stacking wins. So when the pipeline compresses from decades to quarters, what becomes the bottleneck?
Yeah, let's take that as a homework assignment. We need to
I'll speculate.
find somebody who knows.
I appeared on TBPN right before they acquired them. So my
they wanted the footage of you.
What's the line from The Wrath of Khan? Like a bad marksman, you keep missing every time. I think they're very talented, and I take OpenAI at its word that they're looking for a news distribution channel and a content distribution channel that offers a positive perspective on AI. Why they can't do it in-house, why they need TBPN, ? But I do think that TBPN guys are very competent at finding interesting stories. When I made the Eon announcement of the first uploaded fruit fly, the TBPN staff reached out to me almost immediately. Almost no one else did, and they booked me almost immediately. So I think that shows a certain level of competence to be able to chase breaking technology news that I haven't really seen elsewhere.
All right.
Let me give you
a bad marksman. The Wrath of Khan cut is elite. But what happens when the FDA's clinical phase count goes to 0?
Peter, I'll ask you a question. I asked a panel of mine at today's event at MIT. Do you have a prediction for when the FDA is likely to launch, given that it's collapsed recently, this announcement from a 2 clinical phase approach to a 1 clinical phase approach? When do you think we get 0 clinical phase trials from FDA?
0 clinical phases, Maitreya spec regulation. So does the FDA dissolve into an algorithm, or does it just become the algorithm?
It turns out, this is why maybe sometimes I present as a bit of a quantum bear. The physical world is actually pretty classical and pretty sparse. So I would bet we don't actually need quantum computing at all to get to the virtual cell. We solved protein folding without quantum computing. We did it purely classically. I think we get to a virtual cell just by existing scaling of models like Maxi. Maxi something or other from NVIDIA, the trillion token cell model. I think we just get lots of scaling of classical models, and that takes us there without enormous innovation needed.
Today, it's a data problem.
Totally.
The physical world is classical and sparse. Fascinating. But if every sci-fi trope is now just the news, which trope lands first and which one breaks us?
So this is happening. I think in the last episode, I mentioned that one of my operational definitions of the singularity is all sci-fi tropes happening everywhere all at once. One of those sci-fi tropes is call it the iRobot trope, where there are just humanoid robots in every facet of life. Earlier today at the MIT Media Lab, for those who were there, people saw me for about an hour controlling a Unitree robot marching in loop after loop around the Media Lab on the 6th floor. And people were taking selfies. Everyone wanted to take a selfie with me and the Unitree. And I was doing this as sort of a bit of a promotional march for Professional Robotics League, which next on April 19th, so 9 days from when we're recording, the weekend of the Boston Marathon, is going to hold the United States, the country's first professional robotics league match with robots racing 50 meters in the Boston seaport. This is all happening. We're finally catching up to the iRobot future, where robots permeate every aspect of life. For better, for worse, right now, it's Chinese robots that are leading. I'm hoping to maybe almost quasi-shame the US robotics industry with all of these Chinese capabilities into stepping up to the plate and just starting to distribute humanoid robots into the civilian sector, and not just factories and not just military drones. But it's all happening. And this is going to be utterly transformative for the 2/3 of the US services sector that depends on physical labor, manual labor, and not just knowledge work.
I saw Mark Cuban on a video this morning saying this robot thing is a passing phase and they're not going to be around in 10 years. How does someone come to that?
No, but so there was a bit of nuance to that. It wasn't that robots aren't going to be around. It's that they'll become so essential that the environments will adapt to the robots and the robots will blend with the environment. Right now we go to Salim's point. Salim, your hobby horses, why do they need to be humanoid? Why can't they be differently shaped? I think Mark Cuban's more nuanced point was they're going to become so essential to daily life that they'll start to change the houses and the buildings and the environments to the point where they start to merge with the environments and therefore no longer need to be humanoid.
So they're dishwashers.
Yeah, they blend, they merge with the physical environment.
I have to confess, Alex, that robot that you were talking about was blocking my way to the bathroom, and I so badly wanted to kick it. And I was thinking Alex would kill me if I kicked it. It's going to remember, and then it's going to come back in 3
History
years.
will remember, Dave. You really don't want to do that. What's the song from Les Mis? So never kick a dog because it's just a pup. They'll fight like 20 armies and they won't give up. So you better run for cover when the pup grows up.
Tale of two cities, Shenzhen versus the Valley. So who actually wins the embodied intelligence race? The hardware empire or the software cathedral?
I think this is like a tale of two cities. The two cities in this case aren't London and Paris. They're China/Shenzhen and the US/Silicon Valley. The Chinese are overwhelming the world market with the raw physical capabilities. They're producing many, many more capable robots than, let me put it this way. If I want to, as a US citizen, if I want to procure a humanoid robot, I don't really have that many options right now. I'm still waiting for my 1X Neo. I was haranguing Bernd at A360 this year. When do I get my Neo?
This summer. I'm getting mine this summer. What did he promise you?
He didn't promise me a date. We were trying to figure out finer details of his participation in future Olympic events. But I would say China's producing all of these humanoid robots, but the US is producing the strongest VLA, vision language action, foundation models, and world models for the moment. And I think we've talked in the past about OpenAI trying to become Anthropic faster than Anthropic can become OpenAI. I think similarly here, China is in a position where it has the raw manufacturing capability to make lots of robots and is racing to become a robot foundation model provider faster than the US with our 10x more compute and our foundation models can finally figure out our way to manufacture at scale humanoid robots. So we'll see which way it ends up.
Robots merging into the environment, straight up ghost in the shell. And speaking of the invisible, what does crypto mean in a world where superintelligence does not need stores of wealth?
For the record, I don't hold Bitcoin. I don't have any desire to hold Bitcoin. This is the time in the episode where I say something nice about crypto per the Peter Diamandis ordinance. So my something nice about crypto today for this episode is I also don't disagree with Michael Saylor, but I also think it's beside the point. This is not investment advice, but I don't think it's quantum. Again, I've made this point numerous times. I don't think it's quantum decryption that Bitcoin, the Bitcoin community should be worried about. It's AI. It's AI, numerous facets of AI. It's AI coming up with clever inversion attacks against the core hash functions. And before anyone in the comments says, oh, but it gets harder over time, and there are several other responses. I'm aware of all of these responses. But if there is a secret inversion attack against the core hash suite of Bitcoin, this is a major problem for Bitcoin. I don't think that's even the largest problem, though, for Bitcoin. If we're going to talk about Bitcoin X risk, I think it's actually just irrelevance. AI, which is emerging for better or for worse, or AI agents, I should say, is the killer app for, call it, cryptographic commerce and transactions. The biggest risk is just that AI agents don't want to use Bitcoin. I'm aware that the Bitcoin Policy Institute put out this study saying that AI agents, 6 out of 10 AI agents prefer the flavor of Bitcoin versus other cryptographic means of commerce. I think over the long term, it's difficult to buy that AI agents, given their speed, if they stick with any form of crypto at all, are going to stick with Bitcoin. They'll invent their own currencies, their own layer ones, maybe transcendent forms of layer zero, and just reconceive the entire notion of a crypto stack.
Layer zero is trends and transcendent forms. That is ASI Poet Laureate material. So is store of value an artifact of scarcity that just dies with scarcity?
In micro, I would say a long-term store of wealth is basically just commerce by another name. You're trying to store resources in some sense for the long term. I would query whether superintelligence actually needs a long-term store of wealth at all. It's going to be moving very quickly, taking rapid actions in the physical economy. Does it even have a need for a long-term, non-operational, sort of non-productive store of wealth? I doubt it.
Well, I think
I'm not even sure humans.
Superintelligence has no use for long-term wealth, big if true. Then what does a balance sheet even look like at the end of history?
Yeah, at that point, do we need quote unquote digital gold? I similarly, this is not investment advice, I don't hold gold. It's an unproductive asset. It's just not interesting. If we really are in the singularity, as I claim that we are, why on earth would I want to hold gold or Bitcoin?
What do you hold, Alex?
Okay, so again, non-investment advice, but for the record, on the one hand, index funds, fundamentally betting that the market is a better allocator of assets, at least among public securities, than any individual can be. It's basically a bet on superintelligence. And then the other end of the barbell distribution, equity in startups, and where I hold material agency. And to first order, that's it. I don't hold gold and I don't hold crypto. I just don't understand how they're productive assets.
No gold, no crypto, only compute. So what is the productive asset that replaces them when the singularity turns every market into a flow?
I'm cooking all of them. Like I want to cook land. We've talked perhaps in the past about Coastal Assembly, which is using AI to. It's a company where I have a financial interest that's using AI to grow new land. I'd like to see realist. Okay, so a hot take for this episode. If the crypto hot take wasn't hot enough, hotter take since I'm underslept. I think land has got to be made post-scarce, and AI will help us make real estate post-scarce.
Cooking land. I want a bumper sticker. So when AI makes real estate post-scarce, where do the bottlenecks move to next?
I'll make the one comment on the immunotherapies. I think it's also instructive. If you think back, so we're in 2026, if you think back to circa 2000 or 2001, so about a quarter of a century ago, the US Congress was sold on the National Nanotechnology Initiative on the premise that we'd have medical nanorobots swimming through our bloodstream zapping cancer cells. And yet we find ourselves a quarter of a century later where, as you say, Peter, cancer is well on its way to being solved without the medical nanorobots. We didn't need the medical robots at all. This is being done by basically retraining or retargeting our body's own immune systems. And I think that does raise or flag the question, what will, if anything, we need the medical nanorobots that Eric Drexler and others promised us? What, if anything, will we need those for? Or is it just a matter of re-educating our own existing biology to do more intelligent things without needing any robots in our bodies at all?
Immunotherapies echoing nano-hype from 2001. The curve takes its time. So which of today's loudest frontiers is quietly compounding into the big one?
I do think evolution in battery energy chemistry is really interesting. So the historic trend, if we put aside iron air for the moment and just focus on the bleeding edge chemistries, I think the statistic is something like a pretty sustained 8% year-over-year increase per constant dollar in battery energy densities for the bleeding edge chemistries. So in some sense, not in some sense, in a very real sense, there is a Moore's law for increasing the energy densities, while at the same time, we're seeing new chemistries or new-ish chemistries like iron air that are radically reducing the cost for certain applications. Iron air isn't for every application. It seems unlikely we're going to see it get used, for example, for EVs anytime soon. Probably someone in the industry is experimenting with it. But I think we're starting to see, judging from the explosion initially in lithium ion and then exploding to a number of other form factors, different chemistries for different applications, and different applications demand different prices as well. In some cases, when you're powering data centers, you care about the volume of storage and you care about the price. In other cases, you care about the mass and mobility. And those are cases where lithium ion, lithium polymer probably still has an edge over iron air. Overall, I think this is very positive. I think, I sometimes wonder, as a thought experiment, given that there was quite a bit of experimentation early on in the Thomas Edison era with different battery chemistries, whether we could have arrived at much more advanced chemistries much earlier, like 100 years ago, and whether the history of the internal combustion engine would have been vastly different if we had seen more investment and more experimentation up front with different battery chemistries. But overall, obviously, this is a positive development.
8% yearly battery gains, compounding beautifully. So does the energy problem dissolve quietly, or does it arrive as a shockwave?
I think there's an element missing. So I would love to be able to just replace teachers, human teachers, with AI. I think it's basically a cliche at this point that, at least in the U.S., education is subject to Baumol's cost disease, and would love for AI to just replace education, both primary, secondary, and higher ed. What I suspect is missing, certainly for the most self-motivated students, AI, I think at this point, in the style of Neil Stephenson's Young Ladies Illustrated primer from Diamond Age, it's already here. A well-motivated student can already have a conversation with a model from whichever frontier vendor and teach themselves far more quickly than they can through human instruction. But for the students that aren't as self-motivated, what I think we're missing right now is an AI embodiment that holds their attention and motivates them where they lack the motivation.
It's like the gaming.
Yeah, maybe. So I assume, Peter, by gaming, you're referring to sort of a quasi-addictive or
video games.
Baumol is cost disease meets AI teachers. Finally, so what does a kid learning calc from a patient, godlike tutor actually become at 18?
People have been building edutainment games for decades at this point. I grew up with like Math Blaster or whatever back when I was growing up. But the problem is, I suspect, so as a user of these games, you're not motivating the users, children or students, with the exact outcomes. What would have been utterly transformative for me would be not like motivating some math problem with some arguably disconnected animation on the screen. Motivate them by actually empowering them to do really amazing things in the real world. That's far more motivatory, I think, than just an animation or some dopamine push from a jingle.
Edutainment never worked. Harsh but fair. So if motivation is the real bottleneck, what does a super intelligent tutor actually do to motivate?
I get to be this is science medical, I think, is blue, right? I get to be science medical.
All right.
Oh, you're right. You're right. Medical. Why would that be?
Killer.
Just get better.
Well, Starfleet officers and the Abundance logo resembles the Starfleet